So here we are out of the harvest and into holidays that do not have a harvest connection. We saw that, of course, with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which are technically not harvest-based holidays, even though they do come close to the rainy season, and there's some connection between their theme of divine judgment and the coming of the rainy season with its promise to kill or help provide life for people. But now we get into holidays that really are purely either ideological or mythological, that do not have a connection to the harvest, and may or may not have any connection to real historical events either. As we see when we get to Hanukkah, that one has no harvest root, but does have historical roots. These two holidays of Shabbat and Purim don't really have any verifiable historical background, as we'll see. Purim claims to, but as we'll see, there's some holes in that story. So let's start with Shabbat. Now, we know that Shabbat is mentioned very early on in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it's in the very first chapter of Genesis, because the world is created in 7 days, or actually in 6 days, and on the seventh day, God rests from all he has done. And in fact, the word for he stopped is Shabbat. He ceased. He Shabbated, if you could make it into a verb. But what it meant is he stopped and rested. And as we speculated when we were talking about the calendar in general, that might have been a priestly maneuver to encourage people to come to the temple more often. You know, instead of coming once a season for the harvest festival, if you come every 7 days, that's more sacrifices, that's more temple attendance and so on. It could also be that there's some unknown origin of the magic number 7 that has a connection to Jewish culture that we don't know. We do know that there is a Babylonian parallel to Shabbat. However, it doesn't happen every 7 days. In Babylonian religion, at a certain stage, there was a moment called Shabbatum, which was the full moon. It was a time of stopping, and it was a time of fear, where you didn't go out because you were worried about the demons and the gods afoot. And occasionally there were special days in Babylonian months that were marked aside as days of rest or days of not doing things. But the idea of a 6 days and 7 rest rhythm that's totally independent of the moon is really a Jewish original. We don't have any other source for it that we can find. And so, in fact, in the ancient world, Greeks and Romans thought that the Jews were somewhat lazy because they insisted on taking 1 day off every 7 instead of 1 day off every 10, or however they used to run their systems. They did give people days off occasionally, but I mean, not slaves, and that was the other weird thing. Not only did the Jews not work on every 7th day, but they let their slaves not work every 7th day, and their maidservants and their animals didn't have to work on it. That seemed very, very strange. So they had this reputation of being a bit lazy for this reason. And there are certainly some directions of Shabbat that we don't think about that could have been done in past times. So I'm going to read you a description, not with the text, but just read the text to you, that comes from the Babylonian Talmud's section called Shabbat. And there's actually more than one section of the Talmud focused on Shabbat, as we'll see, but this is the one that's primarily focused on Shabbat rituals. The school of Rabbi Ishmael taught 6 shofar blasts were blown on the eve of Shabbat. When the first was begun, those who stood in the fields ceased to hoe, plow, or do any work in the fields. And those who were near to town were not permitted to enter it until the more distant ones arrived, so they should all enter simultaneously. But the shops in town were still open and the shutters were lying on the ground. When the second blast began, the shutters were removed and the shops had to close. But hot water and hot pots could still sit on the cooking range. When the third blast was begun, what was to be removed from heat was removed, what was to be stored away was stored away, and the lamp was lit. That's the Shabbat light was lit. Then there was an interval for as long as it takes to bake a small fish or place a loaf in the oven. I mean, again, they don't have seconds, right? So, or minutes. So everyone knows how long it takes to bake a small fish. Okay. Place a loaf in the oven, and then a tekiah, teruah, tekiah were sounded, and one began Shabbat. Now, I love this anecdote. I have a little more to read too, but I love this anecdote because imagine what it's like if you're living in a town, a walled town with farming fields outside, and it's almost all Jews in the town. And so you would want to announce the coming of Shabbat in a public way. And so you give a loud blast and the people in the fields start to come back to the gates and then they all enter together probably on the second blast. And at the second blast, they begin to pack up the shops, and the people cooking are getting ready to finish up. And then the third blast, it's time, take everything off the stove and take everything out of the way that needs to be put away, and light your candle so it begins Shabbat in your home. And then you blow tekiah, teruah, tekiah, and that's Shabbat for everybody. Now, we think of that kind of public announcement as the call to prayer in Islamic practice or the ringing of church bells. Why not blowing of shofars? I mean, that makes sense in some ways. And maybe over time, as Jews were a minority in both Muslim and Christian territories, they felt the need to tone it down a bit, or were required to tone it down a bit. And this didn't happen anymore. Now, Rabbi Yosei has a comment. He says, I have heard that if one comes to light the candle after the 6 blasts, he may do so, since the sages gave the chazan of the community time to carry his shofar home. He's up on a platform, right? Well, he has to take his shofar home, but you're not allowed to carry things on Shabbat outside of your home. So what's he supposed to do? So the sages gave him a window of 5 minutes, 10 minutes to carry his shofar home, so you could still sneak in your lighting just before, if you use it right after that 6th blast. But the sages said back to Rabbi Yosei, if so, your rule depends on variable standards, because who knows how close he lives to where the platform is. Rather, the chazan of the community had a hidden place on top of the roof where he put his shofar, because you can't handle a shofar on Shabbat. So he would blow it and then put it away right away. So you had like a second and a half, and that's your window. Now, again, what's fascinating about this is they say that your Rabbi Yosei is determining things based on variable standards, but they measured the time based on how long it takes to bake a small fish. Which, what's a small fish? Like you have to define that. Okay. So again, this is one of those cases where this is part of Shabbat we don't know anymore, because we don't do this anymore. It hasn't been part of Jewish practice for a long time. And Shabbat in the Jerusalem temple would have been radically different, because they were offering animal sacrifices. They were doing all kinds of things that the rabbis would later prohibit as labors not to be done on Shabbat, because as we'll see in Leviticus, it says very clearly, you should not do any work on Shabbat. So let's jump to our sources here. So here you have in Leviticus 23, right at the beginning of the list, 6 days work shall be done, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a Shabbat Shabbaton, which means a stopping of stopping, like the Holy of Holies. It's re-emphasis. A holy gathering, you will do no work in it. Melechet avodah is the word they use, which sometimes means productive work. Again, defining what work is, that's a job for the rabbis. Their job is, oh, what does it say here? It says, do no work. What counts as work? Let us go. It's a Shabbat to Yahweh in all of your dwellings. So it's the very first holiday. It's listed at the top, but it doesn't give you a lot of detail of, do you light candles? Do you have to have challah? How long does it last? You just have this rule, don't do any work on this day every 7 days. Well, that doesn't help. That gives us a starting point, but doesn't really help us understand the holiday. Now, here's the description in Genesis chapter 2, actually. It's the end of 1 is the stopping of work, and then the summary appears in Genesis 2. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and this is actually read, by the way, as part of the liturgy when you're welcoming Shabbat in your home. Thus the heavens and earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, God ended the work which he had made. He rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. Again, not a lot of details, but a definition of why observe Shabbat. Now, what's interesting, if you look at the history of the evolution of biblical text, the Shabbat, the Sabbath, occurs in the 10 Commandments, both in Exodus chapter 20 and in Deuteronomy. However, the reason for Shabbat is different in the two sources. In one 10 Commandments, you're supposed to observe Shabbat because God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. But in the other version, it says you should rest on Shabbat because you were slaves in Egypt, and I saved you. And so now you're able to rest. So there isn't even consensus in the two versions of the 10 Commandments of why. They agree you should observe Shabbat, but they don't agree why. So this is, again, one of those places where people point to different sources for the two texts, because you would think they would agree on the reason for Shabbat, and you would think it would agree with Genesis chapter 2, unless this Genesis chapter 1 through the beginning of chapter 2, the priestly version, was written later. And so the version of the Ten Commandments that has the creation as the reason is part of the priestly text, where the version that has the Exodus might be part of an E text or a D text, and was later put together. So again, interesting details when you study the small, subtle parts of the sources. So again, we could go back and look at sources focused on the priestly observance of Shabbat with all the sacrifices and the psalms that were said and so on. But for us, in our practice, we're not doing any of that. We're not going to a temple. We're not offering sacrifices or playing instruments to God. We're under the umbrella of the rabbinic version of Shabbat. And Shabbat for the rabbis is very much focused on do not, but also some do's. They focus a lot on the do nots, however. So as one example, I have a text here from Mishnah Shabbat, which is the first rabbinic collection of sources from around the year 100 BCE to 200 CE. And here it lists the main categories of work are 40 minus 1. Sowing, plowing, reaping, binding sheaves, threshing, winnowing, cleansing crops, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, washing or beating or dyeing it, spinning, weaving, making 2 loops, weaving 2 threads, separating 2 threads, tying a knot, loosening a knot, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, hunting a gazelle, slaughtering or flaying or salting it or curing its skin, scraping it or cutting it up, writing 2 letters, erasing in order to write 2 letters, building, pulling down, putting out a fire, lighting a fire, striking a hammer, and taking anything from one domain into another. These are the main categories of work, 40 minus 1. Interesting question. So they in fact ask this question, why does it say a gazelle? Is it that it's only gazelles and you could hunt other wild animals? Or is it that a gazelle is not domesticated? And so you may be able to slaughter a domesticated animal, but not a wild animal, because that's more running and chasing and so on. What does it mean to take anything from one domain to another, the last category? What counts as a house? Or what if you have a shared courtyard between multiple houses? Is that public space? Is that private space? What if you roll something and it goes across the threshold to another one? You didn't carry it over there, but you caused it to go over there. So that rolling example actually is discussed in this tractate on Shabbat in the Talmud, where they're trying to clarify what all these things mean. And they even ask, why does it say 40 minus 1? Why not just say 39? They know how to say 39.
Because 40 is a neat number.
Well, 40 is a nice round number.
But they use 40 a lot of times. I mean, 40 shows up like.
Yes, it's one of the, exactly, it's one of those magic numbers. But they also will say it's 40 minus 1, and that teaches you that if you do multiple labors within one category of this, then you're only liable once. So each category counts as one violation. So sowing seeds is one violation. If you plow and then sow seeds, that's 2 violations. But then they go on to explain that grafting and pruning, those count under this category. And then there's debates, does pruning count under this category, or is pruning under that category? So they're all trying to figure out, what are you liable for if you break these rules? Now, some of these are not relevant to us today. Some of these are, and some of these have been interpreted to be relevant. You know, and they also ask the question, what do all these have in common? They're sort of all over the place. But what many rabbis will say is that these represent activities of creation or destruction, because you're at the end of the creation of 6 days and the 7th day resting, then you should not yourself create or destroy in that in any of the work that you're doing. So what would happen if you wrote 2 letters? That's the minimum you need to make a word in Hebrew. You've made a word. If you write 1 letter, that's not a word. You can't have a 1-letter word. Or if you even dropped a pen on a piece of paper, you might make a yud, which is a little tiny letter, but that's not a word by itself. But writing 2 letters is creating a word, and erasing 2 letters could be destroying a word. So this idea that it has to do with creating or destroying. And as I said, these are often interpreted to great lengths by rabbis today. So as one example, you may know you're not supposed to light a light on Shabbat. You're not supposed to light a flame light because it says lighting a fire. But what about an electric light? That isn't, it's actually not because of fire. It's because of building a house. You're creating a circuit. One time, my father, who grew up Orthodox, went back to visit his family, and he and his brother were going to take a walk on Shabbat, and it was raining outside, so he went to grab an umbrella. And his brother said, "You can't use an umbrella on Shabbat." My dad said, "Why not?" His brother said, "Well, because the rabbis have said it's like building a house." My father said, "Do you think it's like building a house?" And my uncle said, "It's not for me to say. It's not my, not my department." So this is one of those circumstances where the rabbis are trying to figure out these new devices like an umbrella. And in some cases, they are clever in predicting what might be happening. So I'll give you an example. You're not supposed to light a new light on Shabbat, right? Well, that's even up for debate because in the Torah, it says you shall not kindle a fire on Shabbat. And there's a debate within the rabbinic tradition where one group says that means you cannot have the candles lit at all on Shabbat. You need to do Shabbat in the dark. Where others say you can light it before, but you can't light a new one during. In the end, the rabbis win that one. They get the dominant strain of the rabbis win. They get to light the candle. In fact, they mark the beginning of Shabbat by lighting the candle, and then that marks Shabbat for your household. So they're proving you can light it just before it starts. But you're not allowed to put it out. And then they imagine this scenario. What if I have an oil lamp that's lit, and I take a bag of oil and hang it over that lamp and poke a hole in the bottom of the bag so that it gradually just drips a little bit of oil onto that oil lamp and keeps it burning through the next 3 hours. Does that count as my consciously kindling it? Or did I set up something automatic that runs on its own and then it's not really my active agency that's causing it to be lit? This is a parallel for automatic oven timers and automatic light timers and automatic elevators and all kinds of other innovations that rabbis have to apply these old principles to. But even in the earlier sources, they were envisioning ways to work around it. And this is one of the either funny or tragic or fascinating, depending on your perspective, elements of a lot of these Shabbat rules, because there's all these workarounds. You ever heard of an Eruv? Okay, so an Eruv is a wire that's strung up to create a fictional shared courtyard. Because in the sources, they envision if you have a shared courtyard among several houses and you bring out a certain amount of food into that space, it becomes shared living space because you would be eating there. And so you can define that shared courtyard, that Eruv, as living space for the purpose of carrying. So you can carry things a bit further than you would otherwise. Well, what the rabbis decided is you could actually create a sort of fictional courtyard space, shared public space, with a wire that's often strung up on telephone poles around different spaces that allows people to travel a bit farther, and more importantly, to carry certain things that they otherwise might not be able to carry. I do remember when I was in college, this is before we had electronic key access to our dorms and we had physical keys, some of the Orthodox Jews actually would pin their key to their clothing on Shabbat. You were allowed to use a key, but they couldn't carry it in a pocket. But if they pinned it to their clothing, they were wearing it and therefore not carrying it, and it was permissible. Look, this is the workaround. So Eruv is one of them. Another one is the Shabbos Goy, the idea that you have a non-Jewish person who comes in and lights your light or does things for you on Shabbat, except you're not supposed to be able to ask them to do it for you directly. And the Mishnah says clearly, you cannot ask someone to do something for you on Shabbat that you can't do. So how do they get around it? Well, you invite your non-Jewish neighbor over and you say, boy, it's really dark in here. It'd be a lot easier to drink some schnapps together if it were light. And then the person lights the light for themselves. You give them a glass of schnapps and now you've got the light lit for yourself. And you have to leave it on, of course, over Shabbat. But that's a way to, again, it's a workaround. Do you buy it or not? I don't know. Even lighting the candles is a bit of a workaround. I don't know if you remember in the movie Fiddler on the Roof, or if you had parents who were more traditional, or you yourself were, or even are. When you light the candles, you actually, unusually, you light the candles first. You don't say the blessing first. Normally, you bless the bread and eat it. You bless the wine, the drink. In this case, you light the candles, and you cover your eyes and say the blessing and then uncover them. This is what happens in the Fiddler on the Roof, is just one example. Now, why do you do that? Well, there's a paradox involved, because the blessing is, thank you, God, for commanding us to bless the lights of Shabbat. Except in your home, it's not Shabbat till the lights are lit. So either you're saying the blessing wrong because it's not Shabbat yet, or you're saying the blessing, but then it's Shabbat and you're lighting the candles. So what you do is you light the candles first, and then you light the candles with the blessing, like that. So it's, again, a workaround, but trying to resolve a paradox of law. Now, again, I don't want you to think that this is all that Shabbat is. It's not only laws and rules and restrictions. But what this does do is it makes Shabbat a time marked apart from other times, because there are so many things that you don't do on Shabbat, in addition to some things that you do on Shabbat. And of course, the conservative and reform movements made some accommodations to this. I mentioned before the class started that it used to be that conservative congregations would have a lot of the members drive to a couple blocks away and park the car and then walk as if they had been walking to Shabbat. Nowadays, most conservative congregations have parking lots that are open on Shabbat, because they made a ruling a long time ago that you could drive your car to synagogue on Shabbat. And it's sort of a don't ask, don't tell about what you do with your car after you go to synagogue on Shabbat. And Reform Jews let go of not riding on Shabbat when they were still using horse-drawn carriages in the 1800s. They let go of that a long time ago, long before the automobile. The synagogue service on Shabbat also has some special liturgy. There's a special Torah reading as part of the service, although the Torah is read also during the week and the daily, weekly services. But the special Shabbat liturgy, we're not going to get into much of the details of that, because Shabbat has sort of two stages. It has the home celebration, and it has the synagogue pieces. In fact, one of these canonical songs of Shabbat is called Shalom Aleichem, which is peace be to you. The version we sing praises the lovers of peace, but traditionally you're praising the Malachei Hasharet, the guardian angels. And you would sing it on your way home from synagogue to protect you from marauders or whatever between synagogue and home on Shabbat. Now, there's also a lot of non-liturgical Shabbat traditions. These can include the rabbinic requirement to have what they call a arucha ashira, a rich meal, which means a meat meal. It's one of the reasons why chicken soup became so identified with Shabbat, because it was a meat dish. And for many poor Jewish families, it was a real sacrifice to have a kosher chicken for Shabbat. It cost them a good chunk of their earnings, but it was required. And they might not eat meat much of the rest of the week, but on Shabbat, they were required to do that. There was also a tradition that married couples should have sex on Shabbat. Now, why? Well, Shabbat was often personified as the bride, as the Shabbat queen, and Israel was the groom. It was like God had made a matchmaking between Israel and Shabbat. And so Shabbat's the queen, Shabbat's the bride. There's a song that many people sing on Shabbat, Boi Challah, come to me, O bride, or the song Lecha Dodi, which was written in, I believe, the 1600s. Lecha Dodi likrat Challah, come, my beloved, let's go greet the bride. Pnei Shabbat nekabla, will receive the faces of Shabbat. So if Israel is the groom and Shabbat is the bride, you want the bride and groom to intersect, right? And so in mystical Jewish thought, they actually requested or encouraged Jewish men and their wives to imagine themselves in the roles of the Shabbat and Israel, or the divine presence in Israel in some cases, and then create a union between those two. So this was, again, part of the tradition of be fruitful and multiply, but also to enjoy Shabbat. And the word for enjoying Shabbat is oneg Shabbat, like Hava Nagila, let us come and celebrate. And oneg Shabbat is the celebration, the joy of Shabbat. It should be an uplifting, happy time. In fact, some people imagined that you received an extra soul on Shabbat that would then leave you at the end of Shabbat. But during that time, it was sort of a hint of Eden. You were on a higher plane. Some would only speak Hebrew because they were in the sort of holy space at that time. This was the holy day, and the other days were ordinary days. You would go to the mikveh, the ritual bath. You would purify yourself on Shabbat. In fact, this is one of the speculations of why Jews died of the Black Death at lower rates was they were getting clean at least once a week, which in medieval Europe was way more than most people, because they thought bathing was bad for you. So Jews were getting cleaner. They may have survived disease at a higher rate. Another tradition not halakhically, Jewish legally prescribed, is to have two challah rolls, two challah loaves served as part of the Shabbat meal. Now, why two? There's a couple of speculations for this. One is that if you only served one, it would be lonely. And so they encourage you to have two. Another one is in the narrative of the Exodus. You may remember the Israelites initially are being fed by manna, which is a substance that seems to be appearing in the morning, like a condensation of dew. Well, they're told to collect two portions of manna on Friday. So they don't go out and gather on Shabbat. It's beginning to train them into not doing work on Shabbat. Now, the first time the manna shows up, they're told only collect enough for one day. And some of them are dubious. And so they collect enough for 2 or 3 days and it all rots. And they have to realize they have to trust God. He's going to bring more the next day and more the next day. And then the next stage of manna is collecting 2 portions on Friday. So you have a double portion to eat on Saturday and not have to go out and gather it. Now, the interesting thing to note is challah doesn't have to be what we think of as a challah, which is an egg bread that's braided. This is the Eastern European Jewish style of bread, but there are many other kinds of bread that can be used. In fact, the word challah even appears on a matzah box. Next time you buy a box of kosher for Passover matzah, you'll notice a little writing on the side that says challah is taken. And that doesn't mean that they swapped a loaf for the matzah. What it means is the challah is a little portion of the dough that's taken off and burned up in the oven as an echo of the grain sacrifices that used to be offered. So baking a challah really means you're taking that portion of the dough and burning it up, and then you're baking the bread. So challah is taken even from matzah. It's not only from those kind of loaves that we're used to seeing. Other examples of details, you don't generally have weddings on Shabbat because there's only one bride on Shabbat, and that's the Sabbath. Not to mention you're not supposed to break a glass and you couldn't sign a ketubah. Like there's other things that you couldn't do on that day. I actually, for quite a while, have made a living on doing weddings on Saturdays when other rabbis won't, because it doesn't bother me. In fact, my perspective is going to this wedding is probably the most Jewish thing most of the audience has done on a Shabbat in a long time. It's not like I'm dragging them out of synagogue to come to this wedding. But many rabbis won't do it, or they won't do it till 6 p.m. Although, in the summer, 6 p.m. is not sundown, but they're willing to fudge it a bit. But if you really want to follow an Orthodox practice, you're going to wait till sundown, plus some time on Saturday night. And that's why a lot of Orthodox weddings are actually on Sunday nights or on weeknights, because they avoid the Shabbat rules. And also the rentals are a bit cheaper then, so it's practical. Other examples of Shabbat, if you go to Israel on Shabbat, it's a very different experience, or parts of Brooklyn for that matter. Traffic is noticeably down in many parts of cities. It's quieter. It's almost like a pollution holiday. You'll see a lot more people out on bikes because the roads are more empty. Not quite as much as Yom Kippur in Israel, but definitely more so. And it really is a family time because nobody works. That's the day off there every week. That's the where most things are closed here Sundays, at least Sunday mornings. In Israel, Saturday is the day. Things actually wrap up mostly on Friday afternoon early. And then, by 4 or 5 o'clock, things are getting close to ghost town. And by nighttime, it's very, very quiet. There are a few restaurants open or a few places available, but in most cases, it's shut down. And Saturday daytime is very, very quiet. Now, Jerusalem is different from Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is a modern cosmopolitan city that runs 24/7. Jerusalem, because of the larger Orthodox population there, is more quiet on Shabbat. But it really depends. And obviously, if you're in an Arab town, it's not going to be quiet at all on Shabbat. It's not their day. But that's an interesting flavor of the Israel experience. It gives you an echo of what the shtetl might have been like when the dominant population is Jewish and they're observing Shabbat. It makes a big difference in the feel of the community. Other traditions, you traditionally would have 3 meals on Shabbat because, again, you want to make it celebratory. So you'd have your Friday evening dinner, you'd have a Saturday morning meal, and you'd make sure to have a 3rd meal on Saturday afternoon. People often will read because they can't write, but they can read. And then at the end of Shabbat, there's a ritual called Havdalah. Now, Havdalah means distinction, making a difference. Lehavdil is the verb, to make a difference. And what you're doing is you're marking the end of Shabbat and the beginning of the rest of the week. There's also Havdalah, by the way, at the end of some festivals too, because you're marking the end of a stopping period and the beginning of regular life. So the symbols that are involved in a Havdalah I have here on the table as well. Like Shabbat, which begins with wine, you also have wine on Havdalah. You then take a set of sweet spices, which you open and smell. I have some, I think it's cardamom here. The idea is that sort of reviving, your extra soul has left, so you have to revive yourself with this, but also it's a way of tying yourself by memory, because smell is a very strong memory trigger to this experience of 26 hours or so, because the rabbis had a cushion on either end, of rest and relaxation and holiness and so on. And then as a final symbol to mark Havdalah, to prove it's now time, you light the candle. Just like you began it by lighting a candle, you light a candle now, except for the Havdalah candle is a multi-wick candle. You can see there's many wicks that are braided together in this. They're usually blue and white, but you can do it in any color. You light this candle with a special blessing that's blessing God for creating the lights of the flame, because you have multiple wicks that are lit. Some people have a tradition of looking at the flames as a reflection in their fingernails, because these are sort of the borders of the body, and there's some kind of mystical connection there. And then you actually don't blow out the candle. You take the candle and you extinguish it in the wine that you had drunk earlier, sort of combining those symbols. There's a special blessing on Havdalah that's recited at that point that blesses God for distinguishing between light and darkness, between Shabbat and the rest of the week, between the holy and the ordinary, between Israel and all those other people. Well, there's a problem with that. It's the chosenness doctrine that puts, like, if you made a column here, you'd have holy, Shabbat, Israel, ordinary, regular days of the week, Goyim, the non-Jews. So there are more creative versions today that are trying to address that by not being as, Jewish superiority, and pointing out that you need distinctions to be able to appreciate any individual thing. This is the overview of the traditional approach to Shabbat as prescribed and lived by rabbis. I mean, for many people, it's a joyous time, whether they're living it by strict practice rules or simply as an episodic thing. It could be a time for family dinner, just light candles and sing. Some people go to synagogue services, although we just had a survey of Jewish Chicago that was done by the local federation that showed that only about 15% of Chicagoland Jews light Shabbat candles with any kind of regularity. Only about 30% are members of the synagogue. The number of people going to synagogue is a small proportion of the number of people who are Jewish. So we understand that. And Shabbat is sort of in that middle ground between a home holiday and a synagogue holiday, where there are elements of both, and people might do one or the other, or they might do neither. After all, we're living in a society now where the weekend is 2 days. And what used to be a major dilemma for Jews, where they were required to be closed by the surrounding society on Sunday, and they were required by their religious practice to be closed on Saturday, they faced a real economic pressure to open their businesses on Saturday to compete with everybody else. But nowadays it's less of a concern, because Jews are often in professions where they only have a 5-day week, and they don't work on Saturdays and Sundays, so they get the 2-day weekend that the labor movement fought for, and we get to enjoy a longer weekend experience. It's even beginning to bleed over into Israel. Israel used to work, Sunday was a full work day, and all the way through Friday at like 2, and then they would knock off early, and so they get like a day and a half. But nowadays, many people take off Fridays as well. But it just depends on the job you're in and what you're able to do, and more importantly, what you choose to make out of Shabbat. Because for some people, Shabbat's a real burden. If they're stuck in an Orthodox community and don't feel it and don't believe it, dealing with all these prohibitions and rules is really onerous and burdensome. What's fascinating is people who are not living in that world are trying to recapture some of it. So they're doing intentional, like, technology fasts on Shabbat. where they say, I'm off my phone for Shabbat. So, and I'm off Facebook for Shabbat. Don't even try to contact me, as a sort of sanity producing thing. And sometimes that can actually have some psychological benefits. So again, our approach in general, these holidays are available for us to choose from as they're useful and meaningful to us. And if it's meaningful to you to take a break from technology on Shabbat, then do it. And if it's burdensome or stressful, then don't. We don't define work by what the Mishnah says. We define work by what you consider work and what you choose not to do. So any comments, thoughts, questions on our exploration of Shabbat?
Just one weird one.
Mm-hmm.
Is it permissible if my candle is getting low to light a new candle from the old candle?
Okay. Can you light a new candle from the old candle? No.
Okay. You need really big candles.
Well, or you just let them burn out.
Then you're in the dark.
Yeah. Well, in theory, by that time you're going to bed, and then you got the daytime in the morning, and then by the next sundown you're doing Havdalah, and then you got light again. Or in modern times, you put a timer on a light. You can get those timers that you plug in, and you plug in the light switch into it and the lamp into it, and then when the timer trips, then the light goes on and you've got a light.
I don't know how big Jewish communities might be in some Scandinavian or other places, but or in Alaska, does the time create issues like when the sun goes down at 3 in the winter and it doesn't go down until 11 o'clock at night?
Yes. Well, unfortunately, I think my recollection is that you are bound by the way the sun behaves where you are, even if it's unreasonable. If you're in Iceland or you're in near the Arctic Circle. Right. So it may be. Look, there's even the challenge of astronauts. Yeah. They get a sunrise every 20 minutes. Going around. There's a joke about this Orthodox Jew as an astronaut who says, "I was exhausted, man. I put on the tefillin, take off the tefillin, put on the tefillin." That's all I was doing all day, because the sun's rising all the time. So look. Well, you're not going to light candles, anyways, right? The most you've seen is people like spin dreidels in zero gravity. But yes, there are all these circumstances. Or what if people have actually debated this. What if we went to another planet? And would we have to live by how the sun affects it on Mars? Or would we have to, and there are people who are debating these questions. There are other people who find it kind of an odd debate. Since after all, the holiday is based on the 7-day creation of the world. What are we doing debating that? How far do you want to take this? Yeah. Well, look, the Israeli national airline doesn't fly on Shabbat because it's trying to be Orthodox accommodating, even if it doesn't have to run everything. The women's dress codes for the stewardesses are not Orthodox dress codes, but they're they want them to fly the airline, and it's a national institution. So the army is kosher, for example, even if many of the soldiers might not be personally. Yeah, Al is asking, what happens when there is a community crisis? So, for example, the synagogue catches on fire on Shabbat. What are you going to do, right? Well, basically, the rule is that you can do anything to break Shabbat to save a life. In fact, the Talmud phrases it very interestingly. It says, "From where do we know that you can break Shabbat to save a life?" It doesn't say, can you break Shabbat? It assumes you can. But from where do we know? Where can we prove it? What's the proof text that we can break Shabbat to save a life? And the answer they gave is, you should live by these rules and not die by them. It says in the text, follow these rules and you will live, i.e. and not die. But even more clearly, it says that you should encourage others to observe Shabbat. And so if someone dies, they're not going to be able to observe it. So you break one Shabbat to save the life so that he can observe many Shabbats. That raises the question, what if he's a heretic? Or what if he's not Jewish and isn't doing Shabbat anyway? Well, then they have another reason why you break Shabbat to save a life. But in general, you break Shabbat to save a life. But if the fire is going to burn itself out without hurting anybody, you're not supposed to put it out. If it's going to catch other buildings on fire, then yes, you need to put it out. But if it's like an outhouse is burning in the middle of a field, let it go. Now there are people who will run into the building to rescue the Torah scrolls or things like that. Technically, they're not supposed to do that because they're risking their life when they shouldn't be doing that, even for something like that. But, you know, they go above and beyond. Dawn, Ann is asking about where the liturgy comes from. Yes, and also mentioning that a synagogue had its pipes burst and flood the sanctuary, and they had to borrow a church, which for some congregations they're not allowed to do because of the crosses, and the iconography would not allow them to be in there. So the liturgy is sometimes referred to obliquely in the Talmud, as if people already know what it is. The first Siddurim, the first written orders of prayers, don't appear until several centuries after the temple was destroyed. So we're talking 700, 800 of the Common Era. And so it's the rabbis who really are putting together those prayers in a siddur. Remember, Seder means order. Siddur is a prayer book with everything in a certain order. So that's the origin of the prayer book. We'll talk more about liturgy in a later class, actually, when we talk about varieties of Jewish literature.